The morning mist clung to the Georgia pines like forgotten prayers, shrouding the forest in an ethereal silence that Sarah Mitchell had grown to despise. 1 year had passed since that October weekend, when 3 college friends had vanished without a trace from Chattahoochee National Forest, leaving behind only tire tracks at the campground entrance and questions that festered like untreated wounds. Sarah pressed her trembling fingers against the cold window of her Atlanta apartment, watching the city wake beneath gray skies that reminded her too much of that autumn morning when the search helicopters had circled overhead like mechanical vultures. The missing persons case had consumed her senior year of college, forced her to drop out just months before graduation, and stolen her faith in a God who seemed to turn his face away when innocent young women needed him most. Rebecca, Amanda, and Julia. Their names had become a litany of loss that Sarah whispered in her darkest moments. 3 bright futures, extinguished in the depths of Georgia's ancient wilderness. The call from Sheriff Reynolds came at dawn, his voice thick with the weight of years and unsolved mysteries. "Sarah, I know you don't want to hear this, but we found something," he said, the words cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. A hunter named Tommy Briggs had been tracking deer through the unmarked trails near Blood Mountain when his German shepherd had started digging frantically at a spot where the earth looked disturbed. Beneath a layer of rotted leaves and red clay, the dog had unearthed a canvas backpack, its fabric torn and stained but still recognizable as the bright blue Jansport that Rebecca Morrison had carried everywhere during their senior year at UGA. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her coffee mug slipping from numb fingers to shatter against the hardwood floor, spreading dark liquid like spilled secrets across the room. The backpack sat in the evidence room like a time capsule from another life, its contents spread across a metal table under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look pale and lifeless. Inside, investigators had found Rebecca's wallet with her student ID still laminated and smiling, a water-damaged journal with pages stuck together like pressed flowers, and a small silver cross necklace that Sarah remembered admiring during late-night study sessions in the library. But it was the final item that made Sarah's knees buckle. A Polaroid photograph of the 3 friends standing beside their campsite, their faces radiant with youth and adventure, completely unaware that death was already watching from the tree line. The timestamp on the photo read October 15th, 2023, the very day they had disappeared, and written on the back in Rebecca's distinctive handwriting were the words, "Something's wrong. Pastor Williams followed us here. If anything happens, check the old chapel behind his house." Sarah stared at the photograph until her vision blurred, memories flooding back like a dam bursting under pressure. Pastor Williams had been the beloved leader of their campus ministry, a man whose sermons drew hundreds of students seeking meaning and belonging in the chaos of college life. He had been particularly attentive to Rebecca, always offering extra counseling sessions and special ministry opportunities that made the other girls joke about his obvious favoritism. But Rebecca had grown uncomfortable in the months before the camping trip, confiding to Sarah that Pastor Williams had been asking inappropriate questions about her personal life and making comments that left her feeling uneasy and violated. Sarah had dismissed her concerns as paranoia, trusting in the man's reputation and her own naive faith in spiritual authority, a decision that now felt like complicity in whatever horror had befallen her friends. The weight of 23 years of guilt pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as she left the sheriff's office, the autumn air sharp with the promise of winter and the scent of dying leaves. She had built a life around forgetting, working as a social worker in Atlanta's inner city, channeling her pain into helping other lost souls find their way home. But the discovery of Rebecca's backpack had torn open wounds that time had merely scarred over, and she could feel the familiar darkness creeping back into her soul, like fog rolling through the mountains. Her faith, already shattered by years of unanswered prayers, crumbled completely under the weight of this new evidence, and she found herself questioning not just God's existence, but his capacity for justice in a world where predators wore clerical collars and evil masqueraded as righteousness. As she drove through the Georgia countryside toward her hometown of Dahlonega, Sarah made a promise to the ghosts of her friends. She would uncover the truth, no matter how deep it was buried, or how many reputations it destroyed in the process. Dahlonega had changed little in the decades since Sarah's hasty departure, its tourist-friendly facade of antique shops and apple orchards masking the same small-town secrets that had driven her away in the first place. The mountains loomed over the town like sleeping giants, their autumn colors muted by gray clouds that seemed to press down on everything with a weight that made breathing difficult. Sarah parked outside the Dahlonega Methodist Church, where Pastor Williams had once held sway over hundreds of faithful congregants, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel and tried to summon the courage to face the demons of her past. The church building looked smaller than she remembered, its white steeple pointing toward a sky that offered no comfort, and she could almost hear the echo of Rebecca's laughter from the youth group meetings they had attended with such innocent enthusiasm. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few scattered cars belonging to the weekday prayer group, elderly women whose faith remained unshaken by the passage of time and the accumulation of life's cruelties. Inside the church office, Sarah met with Pastor David Coleman, the young minister who had replaced Williams after his sudden retirement 5 years earlier. Coleman was earnest and well-meaning, with the kind of optimistic energy that reminded Sarah painfully of her younger self, and he seemed genuinely disturbed by the questions she raised about his predecessor's conduct. Pastor Williams was greatly beloved here, he said carefully, his words measured and diplomatic in the way that clergy learn to speak when discussing difficult topics. He pulled out a filing cabinet and extracted a thin folder containing personnel records, his face growing troubled as he scanned the contents. There were some irregularities in his departure, Coleman admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper as if the walls themselves might be listening. Several families raised concerns about his behavior with young women, and the district superintendent suggested it might be best if he took early retirement rather than face a formal investigation. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming suspicions that had haunted her for over 2 decades. She pressed Coleman for more details, learning that at least 4 different families had come forward with concerns about Pastor Williams's inappropriate attention to their teenage daughters, complaints that had been quietly handled through internal church channels rather than reported to secular authorities. The pattern was disturbingly familiar: isolated counseling sessions that ran late into the evening, unexpected visits to family homes when parents weren't present, and a series of special ministry trips and retreats, where Williams always seemed to single out the most vulnerable young women for extra attention. Sarah felt sick as she realized how perfectly Rebecca, Amanda, and Julia had fit the profile of Williams' preferred victims. College-age women away from home for the first time, searching for spiritual guidance and belonging in an unfamiliar environment. The church's response to the allegations had been typical of institutional self-protection: quietly remove the problem, avoid scandal at all costs, and hope that time would bury the truth along with the victims' voices. Pastor Coleman provided Sarah with Williams' last known address, a small cabin in the mountains outside town where he had lived alone since his retirement from ministry. The drive up the winding mountain road felt like a journey into the heart of darkness, each turn revealing deeper shadows and thicker forest that seemed to swallow the light from her headlights. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, its windows dark and unwelcoming, and Sarah could see the ruins of what might once have been a small chapel behind the main structure, exactly as Rebecca's note had described. Her heart pounded as she approached the front door, every instinct screaming at her to turn around and flee back to the safety of her Atlanta apartment. But the memory of her friends' faces drove her forward into the gathering dusk. The silence of the mountains pressed against her eardrums like cotton, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the creak of ancient wood settling in the cold. Williams himself answered the door after several minutes of knocking, and Sarah was shocked by how much he had aged since their last encounter 23 years ago. His hair had gone completely white, his face deeply lined and hollow-eyed, and there was something broken in his posture that suggested the weight of guilty secrets had finally begun to crush his spirit. He recognized her immediately, his face cycling through surprise, fear, and something that might have been relief as he stepped aside to let her enter the cramped, dimly lit cabin. "I wondered when someone would come," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he gestured toward a threadbare sofa beside a cold fireplace. The walls were covered with faded photographs from his years in ministry, smiling congregants and happy families who had no idea of the darkness that lurked behind his pastoral facade. Sarah could smell the stale scent of whiskey and despair hanging in the air like incense, and she realized that Pastor Williams had been living in his own private hell for decades, tormented by memories that refused to stay buried in the Georgia soil. The confession poured out of Pastor Williams like blood from a wound that had festered too long in darkness, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to finally speak the truth he had carried alone for one torturous year. Sarah sat frozen on the edge of the sofa, her digital recorder capturing every syllable while her mind reeled with the magnitude of what she was hearing. Williams described how he had followed the three friends to their campsite that October weekend, consumed by an obsession with Rebecca that had grown beyond his ability to control or rationalize. He had watched them from the forest, waiting for the perfect moment to approach Rebecca alone. But the girls had stayed together throughout the day, their laughter echoing through the trees like a mockery of his dark intentions. As night fell and they gathered around their campfire, Williams had finally emerged from his hiding place, carrying with him a bottle of wine laced with sleeping pills that he claimed was a gift from the church youth ministry for their successful camping trip. The drug had worked quickly, Williams explained, his voice shaking with remembered terror and shame as he described watching the three young women collapse one by one beside the dying fire. But what was meant to be a temporary incapacitation had gone horribly wrong. Amanda and Julia, both smaller than Rebecca, had consumed lethal doses of the sedative, their breathing growing shallow, and then stopping entirely while Williams panicked in the darkness. Rebecca had awakened briefly as he tried to revive her friends, her eyes wide with horror and betrayal as she realized what he had done, and she had managed to scratch his face and escape into the forest before the drugs finally claimed her consciousness. Williams had spent the entire night searching for her in the impenetrable darkness, calling her name until his voice gave out. But by morning she was gone, swallowed by the vast wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction without roads or trails to guide her home. Sarah felt bile rising in her throat as Williams described the methodical way he had disposed of the evidence, burying Amanda and Julia's bodies in a ravine miles from the campsite, and scattering their belongings to make it look like they had simply vanished into thin air. He had found Rebecca's backpack near the tree line, where she had dropped it during her escape, and he had buried it separately as a kind of shrine to his guilt, unable to destroy the final proof of her existence, but equally unable to face what it represented. For days afterward, he had joined the search parties, playing the role of concerned pastor while knowing that every helicopter and bloodhound was looking in the wrong places, following false trails that led nowhere because the truth was already buried beneath Georgia clay. The weight of his deception had grown heavier with each passing year, driving him to alcohol and isolation as he watched Rebecca's parents age prematurely from grief and saw Sarah's own faith crumble under the pressure of unanswered questions. But it was William's final revelation that shattered what remained of Sarah's composure. Rebecca Morrison was still alive. She had survived 3 days in the wilderness before collapsing from exposure and dehydration near a logging road, where she was found by migrant workers who spoke no English and had no knowledge of the missing persons case dominating local news. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation during her ordeal had left her with severe memory impairment and childlike mental capacity, and she had been admitted to a state facility for the developmentally disabled under the name Jane Doe when her rescuers abandoned her at a rural hospital emergency room. Williams had discovered her fate through his connections in the social services network, but rather than reveal the truth and face justice for his crimes, he had chosen to let the world believe she was dead while she lived out her days in institutional limbo, her brilliant mind reduced to fragments and shadows by his selfish violence. The cabin fell silent except for the sound of Williams's ragged breathing and Sarah's barely suppressed sobs, the weight of 1 year of unnecessary grief settling between them like a physical presence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending pine branches scraping against the roof with sounds like fingernails on glass. Sarah's recorder continued running, capturing the ambient noise of a confession that would finally bring justice to her friends and closure to their families. But she felt no triumph in this moment, only a profound exhaustion that seemed to seep into her bones and settle there permanently. Williams looked older than his 68 years. His face collapsed with the relief of finally telling the truth and the terror of facing its consequences. And Sarah realized that part of her had died in this cabin, along with her last illusions about justice and redemption. The man she had once trusted with her spiritual guidance had revealed himself to be a monster wearing the mask of righteousness, and she didn't know if her faith could survive this final, devastating betrayal. The Georgia State Mental Health Facility in Milledgeville rose from the rural landscape like a monument to forgotten suffering, its red brick buildings connected by covered walkways that had witnessed decades of human tragedy and resilience. Sarah's hands shook as she filled out the visitors' forms, her pen catching on the paper as she wrote Rebecca Morrison's real name for the first time in over a year. The social worker who met her in the lobby was a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson who had worked with Jane for the past 10 months, completely unaware that her patient was the subject of Georgia's most talked-about missing persons case. "She's had a difficult recovery," Patterson explained, as they walked down antiseptic hallways, lined with faded motivational posters and artificial plants that fooled no one. Severe trauma-induced amnesia, developmental regression, episodes of terror when men approached too quickly. We always suspected something terrible had happened to her before she came to us, but without family or records, there was no way to piece together her history. The woman sitting in the recreational area bore little resemblance to the vibrant college student Sarah remembered from their shared youth, her once lustrous hair now dull and cut short for easy maintenance. Rebecca rocked gently in her chair, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit while humming a melody that Sarah recognized as an old hymn from their campus ministry days, her voice sweet and clear despite the vacant expression in her eyes. She looked up when Sarah approached, her face showing the kind of innocent curiosity that belonged to a child rather than a 22-year-old woman, and Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from crying out at the injustice of seeing her brilliant friend reduced to this fragile shell of herself. "Hello," Rebecca said in a soft voice, her words carefully articulated as if she had to think about each syllable before speaking. "Are you here to visit me? I don't get many visitors except for the church ladies who come to sing songs." Sarah knelt beside Rebecca's chair, fighting back tears as she introduced herself, and began the delicate process of trying to spark some recognition in her friend's damaged mind. She pulled out old photographs from college, including several of the three friends together at various campus events, watching Rebecca's face for any flicker of memory or connection. At first, there was nothing but polite interest, the kind of response Rebecca might give to pictures of strangers. But when Sarah showed her a photo of their campus ministry group with Pastor Williams prominently featured, Rebecca's entire demeanor changed. Her body went rigid, the stuffed rabbit falling from her hands as she began to hyperventilate, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at William's smiling face in the photograph. "Bad man," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her panicked breathing. "Bad man hurt my friends. Bad man in the dark with the fire that went out." The breakthrough was both heartbreaking and electrifying, confirming that somewhere deep in Rebecca's traumatized psyche lay the memories that could finally bring Williams to justice and provide closure for Amanda and Julia's families. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked patiently with Rebecca and Mrs. Patterson to coax more fragments of memory to the surface, each revelation a piece of the puzzle that had haunted her for the past year. Rebecca remembered pieces of that terrible night, the taste of wine that made her sleepy, her friends falling down and not waking up, running through dark trees while someone called her name, and finally collapsing beside a road where nice men who didn't speak English had found her and carried her to safety. Her memories were fragmented and childlike, filtered through severe brain trauma and months of protective amnesia, but they corroborated Williams's confession in crucial details that only a witness could know. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the facility's courtyard, Sarah felt a profound shift in her understanding of justice and redemption that went beyond the legal implications of Rebecca's testimony. Her friend was not the same person she had known and loved in college. That Rebecca Morrison had died in the Georgia wilderness 23 years ago, leaving behind this gentle, damaged soul who hummed hymns and found comfort in simple pleasures. Yet there was something beautiful in Rebecca's survival, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that no amount of evil could completely destroy. Sarah realized that her own journey toward healing would not come from seeing Williams punished, though justice was certainly necessary, but from learning to find meaning in the act of witness itself, being present for Rebecca's truth, and ensuring that her story was finally heard after decades of silence. The visit ended with Rebecca asking Sarah to stay for dinner, her childlike enthusiasm cutting through the institutional atmosphere like sunlight through storm clouds. As Sarah held her friend's hand and listened to her excited chatter about the evening's planned activities, a movie in the common room and ice cream for dessert, she felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought was dead forever. It wasn't the return of her old faith, which had been built on naive assumptions about how God worked in the world, but something deeper and more mature, a recognition that grace could be found even in the deepest valleys of human suffering. Rebecca had survived not because of divine intervention or human goodness, but through the mysterious alchemy of resilience that allowed broken things to continue growing toward whatever light they could find. The confrontation with Williams took place at dawn in the ruins of the chapel behind his cabin, the crumbling stone walls bearing witness to what would be either the final burial of truth or its resurrection after decades in darkness. Sarah arrived to find him kneeling among the collapsed pews, his confession from the previous night having stripped away the last pretenses of his pastoral facade, leaving only a broken man facing the weight of his crimes. The morning mist swirled around the ancient stones like the ghosts of prayers offered long ago, when this place had been sacred to believers who trusted their spiritual leaders to guide them toward righteousness rather than lead them into temptation. Sarah carried with her a manila envelope containing copies of Rebecca's medical records, William's recorded confession, and detailed maps showing the locations where Amanda and Julia's bodies lay waiting for proper burial after more than 2 decades of unmarked rest. The confrontation felt ritualistic, almost biblical in its setting. 2 people standing in the ruins of faith, one seeking justice, and the other finally ready to face the consequences of choices that had echoed through multiple lives like stones thrown into still water. Williams looked up as Sarah approached, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and what appeared to be genuine remorse for the magnitude of his sins. "I knew you would come back," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority that had once commanded congregations and inspired trust in vulnerable young people seeking spiritual guidance. He gestured toward the collapsed altar, where morning light filtered through gaps in the stone, creating patterns that shifted and danced like living things. "I built this chapel with my own hands 30 years ago, back when I still believed God would forgive anything if you were truly sorry," he continued, his words heavy with the weight of lost faith and delayed accountability. "I used to come here every morning to pray for the strength to confess. But somehow the prayer always turned into a plea for more time, more silence, more protection from the truth." Sarah realized that Williams had been conducting his own twisted form of penance in this ruined sanctuary, neither fully repenting nor completely embracing his crimes, but existing in a liminal space between confession and denial that had slowly driven him toward madness. The sound of approaching vehicles broke through the morning stillness, and Sarah turned to see Sheriff Reynolds' patrol car followed by 2 unmarked sedans making their way up the mountain road toward Williams' cabin. She had called the sheriff the previous evening after leaving Rebecca at the mental health facility, providing him with copies of the recorded confession and enough evidence to obtain search warrants for the burial sites Williams had described. The arrival of law enforcement marked the end of Williams' decades of hiding and the beginning of a legal process that would finally bring official recognition to crimes that had been whispered about but never prosecuted. Williams rose slowly from his knees, his movements deliberate and resigned as he watched the officers spread out around the property with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had seen too much of human darkness to be surprised by its newest revelation. "I won't run," he told Sarah, his voice barely audible above the sound of car doors slamming and radios crackling with official communications. "I'm tired of carrying this alone." But as Sheriff Reynolds approached with handcuffs ready, Williams suddenly grabbed a gasoline can that had been hidden behind the altar, dousing the manila envelope containing the evidence with fuel before Sarah could react. His eyes had taken on a wild, desperate quality that reminded her of cornered animals willing to destroy everything rather than face capture. And she realized that his apparent resignation had been a performance designed to lower her guard. "Nobody needs to know about Rebecca," he hissed, his voice transforming from defeated confession to desperate self-preservation as he struck a match and held it inches from the gasoline-soaked papers. "She's happy where she is, better off without memories that would only cause her pain. Let the dead stay buried, and the living find peace in ignorance." The flame flickered in the morning breeze like a tiny demon dancing on the head of a match, and Sarah understood that Williams was willing to destroy the evidence rather than face the full consequences of his actions, even if it meant condemning Rebecca to permanent anonymity, and Amanda and Julia's families to eternal uncertainty about their daughter's fates. Time seemed suspended in that moment between confession and destruction, with the flickering match representing the fragile boundary between justice and perpetual cover-up. Sarah could hear Sheriff Reynolds shouting for Williams to drop the flame, while deputies took positions around the ruined chapel, their weapons drawn but useless against the threat of evidence being reduced to ash and memory. The morning mist continued to swirl around the ancient stones, and Sarah found herself praying for the first time in years, not to the God of her childhood faith who had failed to protect innocent young women from a predator in clerical clothing, but to something deeper and more mysterious that might intervene to prevent the final burial of truth. She thought of Rebecca humming hymns in her hospital bed, of Amanda and Julia's parents growing old without answers, of all the other potential victims who might still be at risk if Williams's crimes remained hidden beneath layers of institutional protection and willful ignorance. The match burned lower, its flame approaching Williams's fingers with mathematical inevitability, and Sarah realized that everything she had worked for over the past 24 hours hung in the balance of this single moment between light and darkness. The intervention came not from divine providence, but from the most unlikely source imaginable. Rebecca herself, appearing at the edge of the chapel ruins like a ghost materialized from memory and longing. She had somehow escaped from the mental health facility during the night shift change, following some deep instinct that had guided her back to the mountains, where her nightmare had begun 1 year earlier. Her voice cut through the tension with crystalline clarity as she called out, "Pastor Williams, why did you hurt my friends?" The words carried the innocent directness of a child's question, but the moral weight of an adult's accusation, and Williams's hand trembled so violently that the match fell harmlessly to the stone floor, extinguishing itself against the damp morning air. Rebecca stepped into the chapel with the fearless curiosity she had possessed in college, her damaged mind apparently unable to process the danger of the situation, but somehow drawn to this place where her ordeal had begun and where it would finally end. Sheriff Reynolds moved quickly to secure the evidence, while Williams stood frozen in shock at seeing his victim alive and present after a year of believing she was safely contained in institutional anonymity. Rebecca approached him without apparent fear, her face filled with the kind of forgiveness that comes from innocence rather than understanding, and she reached out to touch his hand with the gentle gesture of someone offering comfort to a person in distress. "You look sad," she said simply, her words carrying more power than any accusation could have mustered. "The church ladies taught me that Jesus loves everyone, even the people who do bad things." Williams collapsed to his knees at her touch, sobbing with the kind of raw emotion that comes from months of suppressed guilt finally finding release. And Sarah realized she was witnessing something profound, not just the resolution of a criminal case, but a moment of grace that transcended human understanding of justice and mercy. The archaeological excavation of Amanda and Julia's burial site took 3 days to complete, during which Sarah remained at Rebecca's side, while teams of forensic investigators carefully recovered the physical remains of her friends from their unmarked grave in the Georgia mountains. The process was both scientifically precise and deeply emotional, with each bone and artifact photographed and cataloged before being prepared for transport to the state crime lab for formal identification. Rebecca seemed to understand that something important was happening, though she couldn't quite grasp the full magnitude of what was being uncovered from the red clay soil. She spent hours collecting wildflowers to place at the excavation site, humming the same hymns that had comforted her during her months of institutional care, and Sarah found herself joining in the familiar melodies, despite her complicated relationship with the faith that had first brought them all together so recently. The sound of their voices carried across the mountain clearing like a benediction for the dead and the living alike. The trial of Pastor Williams became a media sensation that drew national attention to issues of clerical abuse and institutional cover-ups. But Sarah found herself caring less about the spectacle than about the quiet moments of healing that occurred in its margins. Rebecca's testimony was brief and childlike, delivered in the same gentle voice she used to ask for extra dessert at the mental health facility, but its impact on the jury was unmistakable. Williams pled guilty to all charges rather than subject his victim to cross-examination, accepting a life sentence with the same resignation he had shown in the ruined chapel. The families of Amanda and Julia were finally able to bury their daughters in ceremonies that drew hundreds of mourners who had kept their memory alive through months of uncertainty. And Sarah spoke at both services about the friendship that had shaped her young adulthood, and the love that had never died despite the passage of time and the weight of tragedy. In the months that followed, Sarah made arrangements to bring Rebecca to a smaller, more personal care facility near Atlanta, where she could visit regularly and maintain the connection that had been severed so violently 1 year earlier. They spent hours together looking through old photographs and listening to music from their college days, and while Rebecca would never recover the brilliant mind she had once possessed, there was something beautiful in the way she approached each day with wonder and gratitude for simple pleasures. Sarah found herself returning to church for the first time in months, not because she had recovered her old faith, but because she had discovered something deeper. A understanding that grace could be found even in the darkest valleys of human experience. and that sometimes the most profound healing came not from forgetting pain, but from learning to carry it with compassion for both victims and perpetrators. The case had been closed, justice had been served, and three friends who had set out on a camping trip in October 2023 had finally found their way home to rest and remembrance, and the complicated mercy of lives lived fully in the shadow of great loss.